Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so as I mentioned in the intro, Jessica Mertz is the executive director of the Clery Center. So, Jessica, I was hoping you could kind of start with, an explanation of what the Clery Center is, maybe an origin story, like explaining how it came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Clery Center is a nonprofit organization, and we work with colleges and universities across the country to help improve their campus safety efforts. One of the primary things we do is that we train campus administrators directly to help them implement a federal law called the Clery Act. And the Clery Act, it requires institutions to do a number of things, including report publicly their crime data. There's requirements around supporting victims of violence, and it also requires them to publicly outline what some of their policies and procedures are going to be around campus safety. So ultimately, what we're doing is helping institutions build some infrastructure and some framework to create safer communities.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a really powerful origin story that I think is probably very relatable to the audience of this podcast. We were founded by Connie and Howard Clery over 35 years ago after the murder of their daughter, Jean Clery, in 1986. And Jean was a freshman at Lehigh University when another student came into her dorm room and brutally raped and murdered her. And I've talked to Connie Clery, who's still connected with the organization, and she will often talk about how when they were looking at institutions and deciding where Jean was going to go, that safety really was a big factor for them. They were paying attention to that, and it was part of why they made the decision for her to ultimately go to Lehigh University because their perception for them was that it had a reputation of being a very safe and suburban setting. And certainly after that tragedy, one of the things that they came to learn and that we still talk about often as an organization is that you really can't think about an institution as being safe or unsafe, that
Mm-hmm.
these types of violence and harm can ultimately happen anywhere. And that's a message that we often want to communicate to people, is to not just think about institutions as these bucolic settings that are immune to violence and harm, but to really recognize as a consumer and as a community member that there are things you need to be aware of, and that there's resources and policies in place to help make that community safer.
Mm-hmm. And the ultimate message is also not that Lehigh is a less safe place than other colleges. This is a terrible confluence of events.
Of course,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And we've had the opportunity to work with them and with other institutions over the years, and just thinking about, what can be learned from that tragedy. And
Mm-hmm.
so much has changed and transformed at that institution and at institutions across the country since then because of the passage of the Clery Act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, kind of, I think next steps going forward then, what do you as a parent, how will you talk to your kids?
Mm.
Since you actually know a lot more than most parents about safety, that's both a gift of kind of a blessing and a curse, right? So how will you address these issues with your own kids, your own students?
Yes, it is a blessing and a curse. I often get some eye rolls at home already telling me that I know too much. And I always tell them, you'll thank me someday, someday. I think that what I have the privilege of, obviously in this position, learning a lot about campus safety and working directly with campus safety professionals, and also being a parent and having these conversations, with my peers about what does safety look like, and how can you prepare a student when they're going to college. And I think one of the things that always stands out to me is really how much, I would say, the concerns are misdirected. I think people are very focused on thinking about crime in the surrounding area,
Hmm.
and don't think about crime that could be happening within the campus community, or types of harm that can be happening within the campus community. And I think because of that, their attention often gets diverted in the wrong way, of thinking that, oh, all I need to be worrying about is what is this institution doing to protect my student from, the community surrounding the institution. But
Hmm.
really, when you look at the crime rates, and when you understand what are some of the higher risk incidents happening at an institution, it is things that are likely to be perpetrated by other students, by other members of the community, things like sexual assault, hazing, hate crimes. And the reality is those are sometimes much more difficult conversations to have with children and to
Mm-hmm.
prepare them for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the terrible thing is that it could be somebody that you thought of as a friend, right? In every
Absolutely.
one of those circumstances. And that's so much harder to think about. So, so
Absolutely.
how, yeah. So how do you, like, what do you advise parents and students to think about? Like, how do they prepare themselves? And how do they also, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. You're going to want to break this into pieces, but how do they also make sure they're not part of this culture? That
Hmm.
they don't
Hmm.
get, like, you think about hazing, that's usually a group situation. How do you make sure
Yes.
you're not swept up in something like that?
Yeah, I think that the most important place to start is really to get an understanding of what safety means in particular to your child. Figure out what it is that's going to make them feel safe. And this is going to be very dependent on people's identities, on their lived experiences. And you might need to recognize that the answer to that isn't always going to be tangible things like a well lit path or security
Mm-hmm.
escorts. That we have found that, at least in my experience, that what is often making students feel safe is a sense of belonging at the
Mm-hmm.
institution, is a sense of community. And I think we really think about safety as part of the institution's culture. So, when you're looking at schools and you're deciding what's going to be a right fit, I would say, and you're paying attention to the culture and the environment and the resources and the services and the academics, think about safety as part of that bigger, conversation about culture. And to have that conversation with your student, with your child, pretty early on, just to start thinking, like, have them start thinking about what is this going to feel like to be away from home, what's going to make you feel safe or unsafe, to just empower them, I think, to consider that as part of their experience and to really make sure that they're prepared for the reality of what that's going to feel like in this completely new environment, which is, part of the excitement, but might also be part of what's contributing to some of that fear and lack of safety.
Mm-hmm. So is there, I mean, I think there's that feeling of safety, but then there's also kind of, incidents can occur, things like how can families sort of investigate, like if they go to a campus and it's a beautiful campus and they're like, well, I totally feel safe here, right?
Yeah.
This looks beautiful. Everybody walking around looks like me and looks like my friends. I feel
Mm,
completely safe. How do they dig a little deeper and understand in maybe some concrete ways about, situations that might be more challenging, how to defend themselves to the extent that's possible? And believe me, I know it's not, you know what I mean? Like, I wonder if we could
sure.
get into some more concrete details.
Sure. Well, to go back to your earlier question about how do you talk to your child about not being part of the problem, right?
Hmm.
And I think it's a difficult conversation to have because you often don't want to think about of your child as potentially harming somebody else or contributing to, an environment where violence or crime are occurring. But the reality is when we look at some of these really pervasive issues like sexual assault, domestic violence, hazing, it's not just the people who are committing those acts who are responsible for that culture. It's all of the people
Hmm.
who are also ignoring it, looking the other way, not intervening. And I think there's a real important opportunity, especially for this generation of young people who are being exposed to a lot of this at a much earlier age, through social media, through TV, the things that they're consuming. They know that sexual assault is something that happens in our,
Hmm.
our society. So I would often get asked by parents that they'd say, how do I make sure my child doesn't get accused of assaulting somebody? Or how do I make sure my child doesn't get hazed?
Hmm.
And I would try and reframe that question to them of what can you do or what can you say to them to make sure that they are not assaulting somebody, to make sure that they are not, hazing people, not just thinking about them as being, potentially accused of or of being victims of something. And I think where that comes in is having an understanding of talking to them about what consent is a
Hmm.
good starting point, right? So they understand, what does consent look like? How can you make sure that you're getting it? What role does alcohol and other drugs play in consent? For something like hazing, we see parents minimizing hazing behaviors all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it is often alumni and families who they might know that their child is being hazed or is a part of an organization that hazes, and they just don't take it that seriously. They don't think there's anything wrong with it. So, asking questions to get a better understanding of not just what's happening, but what impact is it having on your child? Are they losing sleep? Are they struggling academically? Are they feeling like they have to do something that they don't want to do? Asking some of those questions that's going to give you a better understanding of what is really the impact that this is having, and how can I get them to take this seriously and recognize that this isn't a healthy part of their experience or their the culture that they're a part of right now. So a lot of it is just those smart probing questions that you have to be prepared to ask. Um, but when you asked about how can people dig a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more so that they're not just looking at what's on the surface, we just recently actually, Clery Center released a guide for families. It's a resource guide for families. And in that, we have some further tips. So I would certainly recommend that people check that out. But one of the things that we recommend is to ask questions about where, if they're concerned about their child's well-being, what can they do? Who can they contact? And what information are you going to have a right to? What information
Mm-hmm.
are you even going to have access to? Because that can feel like a big shift for parents, is you're not necessarily the one who's calling the principal to find out what's going on, right? That this really is going to be them having to advocate for themselves and having to get a lot of resources for themselves. So getting an understanding of what's your role, and what could you do if you are concerned. um, Another thing you can do is ask questions about what the crime statistics are. That is publicly available information. Schools have to publish it in their annual security report. And the
Mm-hmm.
Department of Education also has a website where you can look at those crime rates across different institutions and just get a sense of, what are some of the things that might be issues to be paying attention to at this institution specifically. And I think that will help you know what questions to ask then as follow-up questions. And I think a big indicator is also to look at what information you're able to find online. How can you find the answers to your questions by looking at the school's website? Because that's how you're going to know how transparent and
Mm-hmm.
accessible a lot of this information is. And that's likely where your child's going to be going for information too. So I think it's a really good indicator when a lot of your questions can be easily answered by what you're finding as publicly available information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read an article that talked about how colleges that report zero crime are probably actually, like, they really are truly not being transparent, because we know that this happens on every college campus. And so it's
Absolutely.
counterintuitive, but colleges that are reporting it might actually be the most transparent and have the most positive resources. So dig in, find out more.
Yeah, it really can be counter to what you think, but we say that often, and it talks about that in the guide, that if you see a institution that's reporting higher crime rates, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're having higher rates of crime. It can be that they're making the reporting options more accessible, that they're doing their due diligence and being transparent and reaching out to students and making sure that they are paying attention to what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that students are comfortable reporting it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier too, that I thought, like, let's, instead of talking about how can you protect yourself, how can you make the campus overall safe? Because if you're talking about conversations of consent and you're talking to a student about how do you make sure that you get consent, that it's also going to educate that student about if someone is violating their consent. It's going to help in every way across the board. I think, like, and that was something that I kind of hadn't occurred to me until you said that. But like, educating about what consent is will help your student, will help other students as well.
Absolutely. And I think that goes for a lot of these issues, educating about what hazing is or about what hate crimes are, getting a baseline, level of understanding and comfort talking about them. is going to then, permeate across that community. And I will say so many schools now are doing really great education around these issues and encouraging your child to take advantage of those, go to the orientation
Hmm.
sessions, go to some of these workshops to really use that opportunity to increase their own understanding of these issues so that they can be part of creating this safer, healthier community.
And as parents, take it seriously. I worked at a couple different high schools, but one of the high schools I worked at, the head of the upper school would collect through an anonymous survey information about drug use, interpersonal violence, etc. And the parents never went until he got us, the college counselors, to go, and then they would go because they were very focused on college. But their thought about what he was trying to do was that it wasn't important for their child was fine, their child was going to be fine. And
Yeah.
I mean, really what he was doing was far more important than what we were doing,
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not trying to minimize what I do. I think it's important, but honestly, there's so many good colleges, but your child's mental and physical safety is obviously more important,
Yeah.
you
I mean,
know?
we don't want to create fear. We want
Right.
information to be empowering, but I would say the biggest mistake parents make is to think, nope, that won't happen to my kid, not my
Hmm.
child. And that's just not that's not a helpful reality to live in. I think you need to assume that anybody has the potential of being a victim of one of these crimes or being a part of them, and to just proactively be comfortable talking about it.
And I think that this isn't about fear, because what this is about how do you talk about it? How do you advocate for yourself? How do you advocate for others? How do you create a safer environment? I ultimately think that is actually a wonderful and hopeful message, you know?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
So I really love that. I just want to let everybody know, I went on to the Clery Center website, and the Staying Safe on Campus guide is very easy to find. So so just go on to Clery Center. You will easily find it online. And just to wrap it up, is there anything that I didn't ask about that I should have? Anything you're wondering, or that you would like to say, I should say, that you think people might be wondering about?
Yeah, one thing that I just want to point out, and I've spent many years working with survivors of violence, specifically college students who experience sexual assault or dating violence. And in working with them, in responding and supporting them, I would say that telling their parents and making that phone call was often one of the most terrifying things to them. Um, and I heard a lot of students who were not going to tell their parents or let their parents know what they were experiencing, even though it was having an incredible impact on their mental health and their experience. And a lot of that is because they were fearful that their parents were going to ask a lot of questions or blame them for what happened to them and make them feel like they could have or should have done something differently. And also because they thought that their parents would then be worried about them all the time and wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
want them to stay at college and would want them to stay home. And as a parent, I can understand having both of those instincts and
Mm-hmm.
that being a reaction because of, it is not never what you want to be hearing from your child. But I just want to emphasize how important it is that if your child does have an experience with one of these forms of violence, that having a non-judgmental, supportive response and really just trying to figure out what they need and how you can help them is going to go a long way in their healing process, and is going to be really make a difference in how they then are able to get support and even decide whether or not to report that incident. So I just always want to tell parents that, because it feels like an important lesson that I learned in my role, and I think it's something that people aren't always really prepared for, unfortunately, until you have to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ask questions first and second and third, before. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, Jessica, thank you so much for coming on our podcast. I really appreciate it. I think this is such an important issue, and yeah, just want more people to learn about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that the guide is a valuable resource for folks.
Okay. All right, great. All right. We will be taking a break, and when we return, I will be talking with Nicole Doyle about homeschooling.